All right. Good early afternoon, everybody. Emily, are we on? Are we recording? Can you hear me?
You're good to
Good.
go. We can hear
Good.
you and we are recording.
Great. Okay, very good. All right. Chodesh Tov. We just started the month of Cheshvan, and we are continuing this morning with our learning of Pirkei Avot. Just a quick recap on last week. Last week, we began learning together Pirkei Avot. We talked about the introduction. We talked about why the book is called what it's called. We talked about the context of the book, why it finds itself in a volume that deals with damages, when it's a book that talks about interpersonal relationships and spiritual growth and values. And then we went through the first Mishnah. We focused on some of the character traits that are imperative if a person expects to be an ambassador of Torah. We talked about the importance of tradition, and then we learned the first three values that were laid out in the Masechet itself. We kind of rushed through the end because we were running out of time, but we are going to jump to the second Mishnah today. I do think we'll have time to get through a few Mishnayot today as they are shorter. So I'm going to bring up our sources and we will jump right in. I'll try to give as much background information as possible. Let me just share the screen. Hold on one second. Okay, Emily, can you see the sources? Good? Yes. Okay. So last week we covered the first Mishnah and we kind of rushed through sources 2 and 3 as we were talking about the difference between power and influence. If you remember, talked about power being where you impose it on somebody and influence is kind of where you bring everybody in. We're going to continue with source number 4, which is the second Mishnah in Pirkei Avot. So the Mishnah reads as follows. Shimon HaTzadik haya mishiarei Knesset HaGedolah. So Shimon HaTzadik, this man that we are identifying, was from the tail end of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. So again, I'm going to reference back to last week when we talked about the tradition and the passing on of values. We said Moshe got the Torah, he passed it to Yehoshua, Yehoshua to the Zikanim to the prophets to the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, which was the governing body during the time of the Bet HaMikdash. We're now coming off of that, and we are going to be quoting a statement from one of the men who was living at the tail end of that period in time, known as the group of people, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. Now you should know, just so you can contextualize who we're talking about, Shimon HaTzadik was one of the greatest people at the time. The first Bet HaMikdash, just so you get a little bit of context, the first Bet HaMikdash stood for 410 years. During that 410 years, there were 12 Kohen Gadols, 12 of the highest priests who ruled over the course of the 410 years, which tells you that each of those men was ruling for a long period of time. And it also points to the fact that there was integrity and there was value and there was commitment by each of those men. In contrast to that, just so you can understand also sociopolitically what was happening, the second Bet HaMikdash stood for 420 years, so 10 years longer than the first Bet HaMikdash. During those 420 years, there were over 300 high priests who ruled. And that was because the time period was filled with corruption. There were people who were buying that title, buying that role. There was a breakdown in the value system, and the time period was riddled, unfortunately, with corruption. One of the bright spots on that time period was that Shimon HaTzadik was one of those Kohen Gadols, and he ruled for several decades, and he was again a shining light during that time period. He also had relations with Alexander the Great and was able to navigate some of the political issues that were otherwise arising with some of the surrounding countries and what was going at the time. So Shimon HaTzadik was a major figure, and he is, I guess, considered one of the earliest Tanaim, meaning one of the earliest who was living during the time of the writing of the Mishnah. He said the following. His statement is larger than just a punchline that we know and we've heard over and over again. It's a philosophical approach to Judaism. And he says, Hu haya omed, al shelosha devarim ha'olam omed. The world stands on three things. Al haTorah, it stands on Torah. Ve'al ha'avodah, and it stands on what was at the time sacrificial worship, but now is tefillah. And ve'al gemilut hasadim, and it stands on chesed, on kindness, on unconditional kindness. So the world stands on three things: Torah, tefillah, and kindness. When you read that, automatically triggered in your brain, you should be reminded of three people. And those three people are Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. Each of them iconic of one of these traits. And the Mishnah actually goes in reverse order. Al HaTorah is Yaakov, right? Ishtam Yoshev Ohalim. We know that Yaakov was iconic of Torah learning. We know that he was the one who at the end of his life brought his sons together when he was living on his deathbed and said, I want to make sure that everybody is on par with the concept of monotheism and is willing to pass on the values of this budding religion of Judaism. Prior to him, right, we had each of the Avot, Abraham and Yitzhak, had one son who followed on the path and one son who veered off the path. Yaakov wants to make sure everybody's on board. He's iconic of Torah. Again, Yaakov, Ishtam, Yoshev, Ohalim. Ve'al ha'avodah, prayer, should remind us of Yitzhak, right? We know when we're reading the scene about Rivka being brought back to meet Yitzhak, she sees him for the first time. He's outside in the field, right? Lasuach basadeh. He went out to the field to converse in the field. And the Mepharshim explain he was praying, right? It's the first time we have the concept of somebody recorded as praying in the Torah. That's Yitzhak. And lastly, of course, Al Gemilut Hasadim, on unconditional kindness, should remind us of Avraham, whose reputation preceded him, who was Baal Hesed. He was inviting people into his home, Achnasat Orchim, as we see in the case of the Malachim who came to him. Avraham is the icon of Hesed. Shimon HaTzadik is saying, if we want to fully embrace Judaism as a religion, we must incorporate the traits from each one of the Avot. And by the way, we remind ourselves of that every single day. We say in the Torah, in the Amidah, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, right? The God of Abraham, the God of Yitzchak, and the God of Yaakov. The Mifarshim, the rabbis ask, why don't we just make an umbrella statement and say, Elohei Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, the God of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Why do you say the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzchak, and the God of Yaakov? Just say the God of, and then list the names. And the Mifarshim explain that it's important to understand that each one of these men approached God differently. And they each embraced and engaged religion in their own fashion. Abraham engaged God, engaged religion through society, through chesed, through kindness. And that's how he found Borei Olam, so to speak. Yitzchak engaged God, found God, engaged with the world around him through tefillah. That was his religious engagement. Yaakov found God through Torah, through the intellect. And that was how he engaged Borei Olam. We all find God differently. And hence we say the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzchak, the God of Yaakov, because we each have an inclination towards one of those three things. What Shimon HaTzadik here is saying is you need to try and encompass all three if you're going to have a larger understanding and philosophical approach to Judaism. In fact, what he's saying is that Judaism requires three avenues of engagement: the intellect, Torah, the soul, tefillah, and the social aspect, chesed. any one of them is missing and there's a lack in our religious engagement, right? If I have the social aspect, the chesed aspect, and I have the spiritual aspect, but I'm missing the intellectual aspect, I'm missing the law aspect, there's a tremendous piece that's missing. If I have the law and the spiritual and I'm missing the social aspect and I'm not part of my peers, I'm not part of society, I'm not having an influence on the people around me, then the spirituality and the intellect is not coming into fruition. And if I have the intellect and the social, but I'm missing the spiritual, then I'm also missing a piece there because I have law and I have society, but I'm missing that spiritual engagement with Borei Olam. So Shimon HaTzadik, in seeing the corruption around him that is happening, is making a statement about one's religious engagement, and it's almost a response to what's happening around him. Part of why things are not going the way they're going is because people are missing one of the fundamental principles of religion. Either they're really, really good people, but they're not following the law, or they're following the law, but they're not good people, or they're not following some of the spiritual ways of Torah, and something is missing. So a larger approach, a larger view, perspective of Torah. If you want to be an ambassador of Borei Olam, you must engage God and the world intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally, socially, and then you'll have the greater perspective and scope of what it means to be a representative of God. That's Shimon HaTzadik's statement in Mishnah number 2. Now, just to add on to that, there's an interesting Rashi in the very beginning of the Torah. Right, he said that the world stands on Torah, and that's the first one. Again, he's going in reverse order, Yaakov, Yitzchak, Abraham. The Torah opens and says, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth. Rashi on the Pasuk brings a midrash. And he says, Bereshit bara en hamikra hazeh omer ela darsheni. This pasuk screams out to me and says that there are multiple layers of this pasuk here. We got to peel the onion. And it says, he says, Kemo shedarshuhu rabotenu b'shvil haTorah shenikret reshit. Reshit darko, u'b'shvil Yisrael shenikreu reshit tevuato. Says Rashi, the Torah in other places in Tanakh is referred to as reshit, the original, the underlying thing. And so when the Torah says, Bereshit bara Elohim, that in the beginning God created the world, and on the pshat level, on the basic level, it means in the beginning of time, God created the world, of course. There's another layer here to be peeled away and say, Reshit here refers to the Torah, as it is referred to in other places in the Torah, in Tanakh, and it means that God created the world not only with Torah, but for Torah. And in that, Torah is the fundamental foundation of the Torah, right? A world without Torah ceases to exist. So hence he quotes that one first as the foundation of the world, in that a world without Torah will cease to exist, because Torah is the way we see everything when we look at the Torah around us. So that's Mishnah number 2, this overarching approach, philosophical approach to Judaism. We now zone in on some more specific values. So the next Mishnah, which is source number 7, is the third Mishnah in the book, and it reads as follows: Antigonos ish socho kibel mishimon HaTzadik. So Antigonos is the name of the man, and he received from Shimon HaTzadik. So again, you can see the importance that we're placing on tradition. The last man we quoted was Shimon HaTzadik. He passed on the following value, the following concept to Antigonos. And it was as follows. Antigonos said, right, he's passing on multiple things, but Antigonos says the following. Hu haya omer, al tihiyu ka'avadim hamishameshin et harav al menat lekabel pras. Do not be like a slave who works for his master because he wants to get a reward. Ela hevu ka'avadim hamishamshin et harav shelo al menat lekabel pras. But work for your master not because you want a reward, but because that's the right thing to do. V'hem mora shamayim alechem, and the fear of heaven should be on you. Clearly, Antigonos is giving us a mashal, a parable, talking about the way we worship God. It shouldn't be that we worship God because we are afraid of punishment and because we want to accept reward. We should worship God because we believe that God's word is truth, it is emet. If we're being honest about the Mishnah, Antigonos got some heat for this statement for the following reason. As human beings, we don't all have the capacity, and certainly not in the very beginning of our religious journeys, to worship God solely out of fear and out of understanding that it's emet. I'll give you an example. When you're a kid and your parents tell you, you better come home by 12 o'clock or I'm taking the car keys away, you're coming home at 12 o'clock because you don't want to have your car keys taken away. In my 17-year-old brain, the only thing that's registering, that's a motivating factor for me listening to my parents is because they rule over me and they have the ability to punish and to reward. When I become a parent in my own right, and then understand what it means for a parent to be worrying about their child at 12 o'clock at night, I then understand what it means to respect a parent, to do what a parent asks, not because they can punish or reward me anymore, because I'm a 35-year-old, 40-year-old, 45-year-old man, and I'm not subject to their rule anymore, but I'm following what they say because I understand the truth in their words. In the beginning of my journey of being a human being, I was responding to my parents because of reward and punishment. Later on in my journey of being a person, being an adult, my relationship with them changes, and now I respect them because I understand their perspective. I understand where they're coming from. I understand the truth in their words. And that's really what should happen. So Antigonos was given heat over his statement because he's basically saying, don't worship God out of reward and punishment. If you're not doing it for the right reasons, don't do it at all. And some of the others pushed back and said, Antigonos, if you're going to give over that message, you're going to lose people in the beginning of their journey. If I went to a 17-year-old and I said, respect your parents because they know what they're doing and they're giving you wisdom, not because they're going to take away the car keys, that doesn't compute in my 17-year-old brain because I'm not in the maturity level yet of understanding that. So Antigonos, if you're going to press this on, if you're going to tell children, don't go to shul because you want the chocolate, go to shul because it's the right thing to do, and I'm not giving you chocolate, they're not coming. We have to first bring people in because they're responding as human beings to the context. Once they've subscribed to what it is they're supposed to do, we can wean them off of the reward and punishment, the bribery, so to speak, and we can then have them subscribe to doing what they're doing because they understand that it's the right thing to do. And in that, there's a religious journey that is supposed to happen. In the beginning of our religious journey, in the, let's say, the immature version of our religious journey, we worship God out of fear. I'm worshiping God because, again, I'm afraid of punishment. I'm anticipating reward. I don't want to be punished. And that is the original version of how we engage with, how we relate to, how we worship God. Hopefully, as we mature and we understand the emet of Torah, and we understand the value it brings to our lives, and we understand the importance of it in the larger world,
Leaving right now?
then
Cottage cheese and Freddy's. I'm gonna make Spanish.
Okay, let's go start that.
Now?
okay, sorry, somebody was unmuted. Once we understand the emet of Torah, once we understand the value that it brings to our lives, at that point, hopefully we are worshiping God out of love and not only out of fear. And there's a qualitative difference between the two. Again, when I'm a kid, I respect my parents. I follow what they say because I'm afraid of them. When I'm an adult, I respect them. I do what they say because I understand the truth in their words, because I love them on a different level, because there's an understanding that they have a perspective on life that I didn't understand beforehand. I have matured in that relationship. And that's why it says every day, Ve'ahavta et Hashem Elohecha. You have to love God. It doesn't say that you should fear him. Of course we should fear him. But the higher level of worship, the ultimate level that we're reaching for, is a love which is founded on an understanding of the emet of Torah. And that's not necessarily what Antigonos is saying. He's saying, if you're not going to do it for the right reasons, then just don't do it. And again, he got heat for it, because that can push people in the opposite direction. People in the beginning of their religious journey need to be brought in for potentially ulterior motives. We say, Ma shelo lishma, ba lishma. When you do something originally for the wrong reasons, eventually it turns into the right reasons. You started it because you wanted the candy, you started it because you wanted whatever the prize was, but eventually you come to the point where you're doing it for the right reasons, and you understand the importance of it, and you're looking at it through a different perspective. So Shimon HaTzadik gives us a broader philosophy of engaging Judaism as a whole. Antigonos gives us a statement about our approach to worshiping God and the journey that we go through from the immature believer, so to speak, to the more mature believer who's doing it not only out of fear, but out of love. All right, we're on the cusp of running out of time. We'll jump into the next Mishnah. I don't know if we'll have time to finish it, but we will try. Mishnah in source number 8, which is the 4th Mishnah in the Masechet, says as follows: Yossi ben Yoezer, ish Sereda, v'Yoseh ben Yohanan, ish Yerushalayim, kiblu mehem. Right, so Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yohanan are colleagues, and they're living at the same time, and they received from the people before them. Again, we can continue to see this theme of tradition, right? We started the first Mishnah, Moshe to Yoshua, Yeshua to the Zekinim, and so on. Then we passed it on to Shimon HaTzadik. Then we passed it on to Antigonos Ish Sochon. Now we're passing it on to Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yohanan, this concept of passing on our values. The Gemara tells us that until their time, essentially, machloket, argument, did not exist. During the time of Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yohanan Ish Yerushalayim, machloket, argument, starts to happen and starts to proliferate. It's small. There's only a few things that there's argument on, but we're starting to see the concept of argument now happening. And as time goes on, of course, those arguments grow not only in content, but in number. It's important to understand that background in understanding this Mishnah. Yossi ben Yoezer ish Sereda omer. So Yossi ben Yoezer, who's the first one quoted in the Mishnah, says, Yehi betcha bet va'ad l'chachamim, veheve mitabek ba'afar raglehem, veheve shoteh b'tzama et divrehem. Your home should be a home where the rabbis congregate. So on the pshat level, on the basic level, you should open up your home to Torah. You should be hosting classes, you should be hosting farachs, you should be hosting Torah, you should be hosting Seudot Mitzvah, you should be hosting things that are not only happy occasions, but things that bring Torah into your home. Right? The first thing you do when you build a house is you have a Hanukat Habayit. Why? Because you want to found the home, you want to base the home on Torah. So the first meeting that's going to be in my brand new home is going to be a meeting where we learn Torah, right? And we learn Torah and we share Divrei Torah, and that's how I'm founding my Torah. Your home should be a home where the rabbis meet, where wisdom is emanating from. And you should, so on a literal level, and then we'll see it on a larger level, you should sit at the dust of the feet of the rabbis, meaning you should be eager to hear from them what they are going to teach, sitting and listening to their wisdom. And you should drink with thirst their words. So on a basic level, and then I want to give a deeper level, on a basic level, we should be eager to be learning, so much so that we invite it into our homes and we listen with an attentive ear to what's being given over with thirst. Actually reminds us of the end of the first Mishnah, right? The rabbi said, Asu siyag v'torah, you should make a fence around Torah. We said, what they're saying with that on a larger level is that you should be so in love with Torah that you want to protect it. Here too, you should be so in love with Torah that you're thirsting for it. You want to bring it into your home. Not a day goes by where you don't want to have Torah brought into your life, into your personal life, into your business life, into all areas of who you are as a human being. That's on the pshat level. On a deeper level, and again, remember that during the time of these two men, argument began. The word mitabek, which literally means to sit in the dust, is a very unique word. And it's used in the Torah in a very unique scenario in the following context in source number 9. Vayivater Yaakov levado vayavek ish imo ad alot hashachar. Right? Yaakov is preparing for his meeting with his brother Esav, who he hasn't seen in 2 decades. The night before, the Torah tells us in Parashat Vayishlach, Vayivater Yaakov levado, Yaakov is left alone. And Vayavek ish imo, he ends up fighting with the malach of Esav. Now the word Vayavek is a very specific word. Rashi says, Menachem Piresh Vayitafer ish, Leshon Avak, Shahayu Ma'alim Afar Baraglehem Ayedeh Ninu'am. Rashi says the word Mitavek means they were wrestling. Right? They were kicking up dust. They were fighting with each other, right? Yaakov is fighting with the malach. They're kicking up dust, and in that they are wrestling with each other. Right? And many of the Mepharshim claim that Yaakov is actually wrestling with himself and everything that had transpired over the last 20 years. But Yaakov is wrestling with the malach of Esav. In using that specific word, mit'abek ba'afar, Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yohanan, who were the first to argue, are saying, when you're listening to the rabbis, you should wrestle with them, meaning you should ask your questions. They present something, you don't understand it, it doesn't sit well with you, you have questions about it. Push back, ask questions. Judaism is a religion of questions. It's not just following everything blindly. We're given something and we have an obligation to ask. We have an obligation to be inquisitory and to research and to analyze. Doesn't mean if we don't understand it or we don't like it, we shouldn't follow it. We have to follow it, but we have an obligation to ask and to clarify and to wrestle with the ideas and the concepts and to argue and debate, which is what Judaism is about. We bring the Torah to life through our conversation. I mentioned in the introduction we did last week, the second set of luchot were qualitatively different than the first because the second set of luchot, Moshe carved them and God wrote on them. Symbolic of the fact that man and God are partners in Torah, in that God gives us the concepts and we bring it to life. We bring it to life by debating it, by arguing it, by discussing it, by having conversations about it, by having this educative process. So the two men during whose time arguments started to happen are saying, we're not arguing because we want to argue. We're not arguing because we want to be right. We're arguing, which sometimes is the case. We're arguing because we want to find the truth, because we want to understand, because we want to be clear, because we want to be able to embrace the things that we stand for with a whole heart. And the only way to do that is to wrestle with the information. And we've been wrestling with the information for 3,000 years, and that is what has given Torah the life that it has, and that's what keeps it conscious and breathing and relevant 3,500 years after it was given, because man is still debating it. It is the brilliance of Torah and the gift that Borei Olam gave us, a document that is alive and is giving us our vision and our mission 3,500 years after it was given, because man is still wrestling with it. And I think that's an important message as we read this Mishnah. It's not just to have Torah in your life every day, but wrestle with it, ask about it, understand it, clarify it, always keep it, but do the best we can to understand it fully so that we can embrace it with a whole heart. All right, I think that takes us to the end of the time. I'm not sure if Emily is still around, but Emily, I think that brings us to the end of the time. Yes? Good. All right. Chodesh Tov. We'll see everybody at this time next week. Be'ezrat Hashem. Have a great day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.